a mobile phone left behind in an empty apartment, a search history for jogging routes through a park, saved on a computer hard drive. That was all Washington, D.C. Police had in May 2001, when a 24-year-old intern vanished without a trace in the heart of the American capital. Chandra Levy had been secretly involved with a married United States congressman more than 30 years her senior, a longtime friend of her own family. Within just a few weeks, the affair became a nationwide media storm, engulfing an entire political career, while the central question, where was she, remained unanswered. 1 year later, a man searching for wild turtles stumbled upon her remains deep within the forest of the very park where she had once gone jogging. The next 8 years passed without a breakthrough. Then came a confession made inside a prison, not from the congressman whose name had dominated every headline, but from an entirely different man opening the door to a turning point no one had expected. In 2010, the jury delivered its verdict: 60 years in prison. But just 6 years later, the entire foundation of that conviction collapsed when the very witness whose testimony had been decisive was found to have been dishonest from the beginning. The man who had spent nearly a decade in prison over what happened to Chandra Levy was now released, before disappearing from the United States, forever taking with him a question that, after a quarter of a century, has never been answered. Who was truly responsible for what happened to her on that fateful morning? For 25 years, the Levy family has never stopped searching for answers. More recently, they have even publicly shared their own theories, controversial as they may be, about what they believe truly happened to their daughter. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories we'll be bringing you next. At the heart of California's Central Valley lies the mid-sized agricultural city of Modesto, a place where neighbors often know one another by name, and prominent local families have deep roots stretching back generations. It was here that Chandra Ann Levy grew up, carrying ambitions that reached far beyond the boundaries of her hometown. She earned a master's degree in public administration from the University of Southern California, a prestigious qualification that opened the door to a career in the federal government. For many ambitious graduates of her generation, Washington, D.C., represented the ultimate destination. The Levy family had known Gary Condit for many years. He was the Democratic congressman representing the Modesto area in the U.S. House of Representatives, a veteran politician, married with children, whose public image was built around traditional family values. Through that long-standing connection, Condit helped Levy secure an internship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 2001. She moved into an apartment near DuPont Circle, a vibrant neighborhood popular with students, interns, and young government employees arriving in the nation's capital from across the United States each year. According to her family, Levy appeared to be thriving. Her career was unfolding exactly as she had hoped. She was living independently, adapting well to life in Washington, and building new relationships in the highly competitive world of federal politics. Rock Creek Park, the place that would later become permanently linked to Levy's name, is one of the largest natural parks within Washington, D.C. Stretching through several residential neighborhoods, it has long been a favorite destination for runners, cyclists, and walkers seeking an escape from the pace of city life. Despite its peaceful appearance, few people realize that the park's heavily wooded areas had already been the scene of several attacks targeting women during 2001 incidents that, while Levy was still alive, had not been connected by investigators and had received little national media attention. As for Condit, his political career at the time appeared stable. Representing a largely conservative district in California, he had built a reputation as a moderate Democrat and cultivated the image of a congressman closely connected to the rural communities back home. In public, Condit, his wife Carolyn, and their children were often portrayed as the model political family, an image that would completely unravel only a few months later under the relentless scrutiny of the national media. Friends and fellow interns later remembered Levy as energetic, dedicated to her work, and committed to maintaining a regular fitness routine. Running had become an important part of her daily life after moving to Washington. None of the people who knew Chandra Levy during that spring, her family, friends, colleagues, or even the congressman who had helped launch her career could have imagined that, within a matter of weeks, all of their names would become permanently intertwined with one of the most haunting mysteries in modern American criminal justice history. By late April 2001, Chandra Levy's internship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons was coming to an end. She had already made plans to return to California and had even notified her landlord that she would be moving out in early May. During her final days in Washington, Levy spent her time packing her belongings and preparing for the journey home. Her family was looking forward to welcoming her back, unaware that it would be the last time they would ever make plans to see their daughter again. On the evening of 30 April, according to phone records later obtained by investigators, Levy had a telephone conversation with Gary Condit. The exact contents of that conversation have never been fully disclosed to the public. Early on the morning of 1 May, Levy used her personal computer to search for information about jogging routes in Rock Creek Park, a detail that would later become one of the most significant clues in the entire investigation, although detectives did not immediately recognize its importance. She also sent several work-related emails that morning, completing tasks associated with the end of her internship before leaving her apartment. No friend, colleague, or acquaintance has ever confirmed seeing or speaking with Levy after that morning. This absence of witnesses has made the final hours of her life one of the greatest mysteries of the case from the very beginning of the investigation. Fellow interns later recalled that, during her final week in Washington, Levy seemed excited about returning home. She showed no signs of anxiety or concern, and no one noticed anything that suggested she felt unsafe. Back in Modesto, Levy's family was waiting to hear confirmation of her travel plans. Her mother, Susan Levy, later said she sensed nothing unusual during their final conversations. Everything appeared consistent with an ordinary trip home after completing an internship far from family. Just a few hours later, however, the silence began to feel unusual. There was no phone call from Chandra, no message confirming her flight, no indication that she was taking the final steps before leaving Washington. Meanwhile, life in the nation's capital continued as normal. Members of Congress attended committee meetings and floor votes. Interns rushed to complete the final days of their placements, and Rock Creek Park welcomed hundreds of runners and cyclists that morning, none of them aware of what may have been unfolding within the park's wooded trails. As for Gary Condit, his public schedule on 1 May appeared routine. He attended congressional meetings, participated in votes, and carried out the normal responsibilities of a sitting congressman. No publicly available records indicate that anything about his schedule that day appeared out of the ordinary. By the evening of 1 May, when Levy still had not contacted anyone, the silence began to turn into genuine concern. Even so, it would be several more days before her family officially reported her missing to authorities. No witness has ever come forward to describe what actually happened to Chandra Levy after she disappeared from the sight of those who last knew her movements on the morning of 1 May. Everything that became known afterwards has been reconstructed only from what was discovered more than a year later in the very area where she had searched for jogging routes. In May 2002, Levy's skeletal remains were found in a remote, heavily wooded section of Rock Creek Park, well away from the main trails commonly used by visitors. The secluded location explained why the extensive searches conducted in 2001 had failed to find her. When the case eventually went to trial years later, prosecutors built their argument around similarities in behavior. They alleged that what happened to Levy matched the pattern of attacks that Ingmar Guandik had previously carried out against 2 other women in the same park during 2001. However, one critical point must be made clear. No DNA evidence or direct physical evidence ever linked Guandik to the location where Levy's remains were found. The prosecution's case ultimately relied on similarities in behavioral patterns rather than direct forensic proof. The condition of Levy's remains, after more than a year exposed to the elements, also created enormous challenges for forensic investigators. Medical experts were unable to determine a precise cause of death based solely on the remains that were recovered, an evidentiary gap that would continue to shape the case throughout years of legal proceedings. That absence of scientific evidence later became the foundation of the defense's strategy. Defense lawyers argued that, without DNA, without physical evidence, and without eyewitnesses, any conclusion about who was responsible for what happened to Levy was ultimately speculative and did not satisfy the American legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. For the Levy family, the period of more than a year between Chandra's disappearance and the discovery of her remains was the longest and most agonizing wait of their lives. Even when it finally ended, it failed to provide complete answers about what had truly happened during her final hours in the park. The rugged, densely wooded terrain where her remains were discovered also raised another question. Was the location deliberately chosen to conceal evidence for as long as possible, or was it simply the result of a chaotic encounter with no prior planning? To this day, no definitive answer has ever been established. For that reason, much of what the public believes about the events leading to Chandra Levy's death has never been conclusively proven in a court of law. Instead, it has been reconstructed from circumstantial inferences, comparisons with other attacks, geographical evidence, and a gap in the forensic record that has never been fully closed. A few days after losing contact with their daughter, the Levy family officially reported her missing to the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C. It marked the beginning of what would become one of the most closely followed investigations in the history of the American capital. At first, the case was handled as a routine missing adult investigation. Detectives carried out the standard procedures, searching Levy's apartment, seizing her personal phone, and reviewing her recent phone records and email activity. During that process, Levy's father informed investigators about his daughter's romantic relationship with Congressman Gary Condit, a revelation that dramatically changed the direction and scale of the investigation within just a few days. Once details of the relationship leaked to the public, the American media descended on the story with unprecedented intensity. Television networks stationed reporters outside Condit's congressional office and his Washington residence, tracking his every public movement. Evening news programs, major newspapers, and entertainment magazines alike joined the frenzy. What had begun as a missing person case quickly evolved into a national media phenomenon, combining politics, an alleged affair, and an unsolved criminal mystery. Throughout the summer of 2001, police conducted several large-scale searches of Rock Creek Park, assisted by hundreds of volunteers and professional search teams. Despite those extensive efforts, the park's vast size and dense vegetation prevented investigators from finding any trace of Levy. Public pressure eventually forced Condit to cooperate with investigators, although the extent of his cooperation was later heavily criticized. He refused to publicly discuss the nature of his relationship with Levy, avoided reporters whenever possible, and did not agree to a police interview until several weeks had passed. That reluctance only fueled public suspicion, even as police repeatedly stated that Condit was not officially considered a suspect in the case. Caught in the middle of the media storm, the Levy family found themselves facing a level of public attention that no parent could ever prepare for. Susan Levy became a familiar face on national television, repeatedly appealing for anyone with information about her daughter's disappearance to come forward while also enduring endless speculation and rumors surrounding her family's private life. Then came 11 September 2001. In an instant, the attention of the entire nation shifted to a tragedy of far greater scale. Chandra Levy's disappearance, still unsolved, gradually disappeared from the front pages not because the mystery had been solved, but because the world around it had changed suddenly and forever. For the Levy family, that new silence proved even more painful than the earlier media frenzy. They continued searching, continued hoping, but now they did so largely alone, as the public's attention had moved elsewhere. On 22 May 2002, a man walking through a remote section of Rock Creek Park reportedly searching for wild turtles discovered a human skull and several scattered bones lying beneath a thick layer of leaves. He immediately contacted police. After more than a year of complete deadlock, the discovery marked the most significant breakthrough in the investigation into Chandra Levy's disappearance. Officers from the Metropolitan Police Department, together with forensic crime scene investigators, quickly responded to the location. Because the remains had been exposed to the elements for an extended period, processing the scene required close coordination between multiple specialist units, including forensic anthropologists experienced in examining long decomposed human remains. Washington Police Chief Charles Ramsey personally attended the scene, overseeing an expanded search operation aimed at recovering every remaining piece of evidence from the surrounding area. The site was sealed off for several consecutive days. Investigators carefully examined every square meter of ground, sifting through layers of leaves, soil, and debris in the hope of recovering personal belongings, fragments of clothing, or any other evidence that might have survived more than 12 months outdoors. Levy's identity was officially confirmed through dental records, a standard forensic method when human remains are no longer suitable for identification through conventional physical characteristics. News of the discovery spread rapidly, bringing the Chandra Levy case back into the national spotlight. Although media attention was not as overwhelming as it had been during the summer of 2001, the case once again became a major national story, even as the United States continued to navigate the aftermath of the September 11 attacks. Before the news was publicly announced, investigators notified the Levy family in person. For them, the discovery brought the answer they had been waiting more than a year to receive, while at the same time extinguishing the final hope that their daughter might still be alive somewhere. From an investigative perspective, the discovery of Levy's remains more than a year later also raised uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of the extensive searches carried out during the summer of 2001. Many observers later argued that the area should have been searched more thoroughly in the early stages of the investigation, when evidence would have been far fresher, rather than being located only through a chance discovery more than 12 months later. Those criticisms would later become part of the defense's argument when the case finally went to trial. Defense lawyers contended that systemic shortcomings during the initial investigation had seriously undermined the quality and reliability of the evidence collected afterwards. In public statements following the discovery, Chief Ramsey acknowledged the enormous challenge of searching an area as vast as Rock Creek Park. At the same time, he pledged that investigators would pursue the case with every available resource now that they finally had physical evidence to examine. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for Washington, D.C., officially took custody of the remains to conduct a full forensic examination. It was one of the most challenging forensic cases the office had ever handled, given that the remains had been exposed to the elements for more than a year. The final official conclusion was a major disappointment for investigators. The medical examiner was unable to determine a specific cause of death based solely on the skeletal remains. There were no definitive fractures or injuries that could identify the precise mechanism of fatal trauma. This marked an important distinction from the two other attacks, for which Ingmar Guandique had been convicted in the same park. In those cases, both victims survived and testified that they had been assaulted with a knife, describing clear and specific injuries before the court. In Levy's case, no comparable forensic evidence existed. That gap in the forensic evidence would later become one of the prosecution's greatest challenges. Unable to prove exactly how Levy had been attacked, prosecutors were forced to rely almost entirely on behavioral similarities rather than direct medical evidence linking the crime to the alleged offender. Forensic specialists also examined the fragments of clothing recovered near the location where the remains were found, hoping to identify any DNA evidence that might have survived prolonged exposure to the natural environment. Once again, the analysis produced no significant breakthrough. The medical examiner further confirmed that the skeletal characteristics, including biological sex and estimated age, were entirely consistent with Levy's demographic profile. While this finding supported the identification, it could not replace the definitive confirmation already established through dental records. With forensic evidence proving so limited, investigators were forced to broaden their focus beyond medical findings alone. They concentrated on behavioral analysis, geographical comparisons, timelines, and similarities between Levy's case and other attacks that had occurred in Rock Creek Park during the same period in 2001. Many legal experts, reflecting on the case years later, concluded that the absence of definitive forensic evidence at this stage laid the foundation for the legal controversies that would continue for nearly a decade. It became a case built largely on inference rather than on strong scientific proof. For the Levy family, receiving a forensic report that offered no clear conclusion about the cause of Chandra's death was another devastating emotional blow, adding to the grief they had already endured for more than a year. Not only had they lost their daughter, but they were also left without a complete understanding of how the tragedy had unfolded. The final autopsy report was sealed and became part of an increasingly extensive investigative file, yet it still lacked the single piece of evidence that every major criminal case hopes to possess: scientific proof capable of standing firmly on its own in a court of law. In 2001, while Chandra Levy was still officially missing, police arrested Ingmar Guandique, but not in connection with her disappearance. He was taken into custody for attacking two other women with a knife in Rock Creek Park, one on 14 May and another on 1 July, only weeks after Levy vanished. What made the situation particularly striking was that the attacks occurred in the same location, during the same period, and involved a similar victim profile: women alone in the park. Yet at the time, investigators did not connect those assaults to Levy's disappearance. Guandique was prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned solely for the attacks, entirely separate from the case that had captured national attention. That failure to make the connection later became one of the strongest criticisms of the original investigation. Many experts argued that investigators' overwhelming focus on Gary Condit caused them to overlook a significant lead that had been right in front of them. Meanwhile, the official investigation into Condit gradually came to an end. After months of interviews, timetable analysis, and evidence review, police formally concluded that he was not a suspect in the case. Even so, his public reputation had suffered severe and lasting damage that would take years to recover, if it ever did. It was not until 2008, more than 7 years after Levy disappeared, that investigators began seriously re-examining the possible connection between Guandique and the case. A new investigative team, reviewing the file with fresh eyes, recognized notable similarities between Guandique's pattern of attacks and what might have happened to Levy. Detectives interviewed Guandique again while he was serving his sentence in federal prison. According to later court records, he denied any involvement in Levy's disappearance during those initial interviews. At the same time, investigators expanded the inquiry, searching for additional witnesses and re-examining the entire body of evidence from a new perspective. It was during this phase that an unexpected lead emerged, not from the crime scene or from physical evidence, but from inside the prison where Guandique was incarcerated. One of Guandique's fellow inmates, Armando Morales, approached authorities claiming that Guandique had privately confessed to him about what had happened to Levy during conversations behind bars. For investigators, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting nearly a decade to receive. At the time, however, no one could have anticipated that Morales' testimony would later become the source of a major legal controversy. Relying on Morales' statements, together with their strengthened behavioral pattern argument, prosecutors ultimately decided to formally charge Guandique with Levy's murder in 2009, 8 years after her disappearance, bringing the longest investigative phase of the case to a close. For the Levy family, The announcement of formal charges brought renewed hope after years of living without answers. What they could not have known was that the legal battle ahead would continue for almost another decade. Because Guandique had already been serving a federal prison sentence for several years, the new charge did not require a traditional arrest. Instead, he was transferred from federal custody to the jurisdiction of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia to face the new allegation. At his initial arraignment, Guandique formally entered a plea of not guilty, a standard step in the American criminal justice system that allowed his defense team sufficient time to review the extensive body of evidence before the case proceeded to trial. Since he was already incarcerated for other offenses, there was virtually no possibility of Guandique being granted bail. He remained in custody throughout the pre-trial proceedings, a process that lasted a considerable length of time as both sides worked through the enormous volume of material accumulated during 8 years of investigation. News of the formal indictment spread quickly across the United States, renewing public interest in a case that had captivated the nation nearly a decade earlier. Many Americans, who had largely forgotten the story amid the major events of the 2000s, suddenly found themselves revisiting the mystery that had once dominated national headlines. Prosecutors in Washington, D.C., began assembling their trial brief, bringing together every piece of evidence collected over the previous 8 years, from phone records and internet search history to Armando Morales' testimony and details of the 2 previous assaults for which Guandique had already been convicted. Guandique's court-appointed defense lawyer, assigned because he could not afford private counsel, began developing a strategy centered on what they considered the prosecution's greatest weakness: the complete absence of direct physical evidence linking their client to the scene. For Gary Condit's family, the decision to prosecute Guandique brought a measure of relief, albeit years too late. After living for so long under the shadow of public suspicion, another individual had finally been formally accused, a man entirely unconnected to their family. Even so, Condit's legal team continued to closely monitor the proceedings, fully aware that any unexpected development during the trial could once again draw their client's name back into the center of public attention. The judge assigned to the case began scheduling a series of pre-trial hearings, during which both sides addressed witness lists, the admissibility of evidence before the jury, and numerous procedural issues. That preparation process lasted nearly a year before the trial itself could officially begin. For the national media, the lead-up to the trial revived memories of the turbulent summer of 2001, when politics, an alleged affair, and an unsolved criminal mystery had combined to create one of the most closely watched stories of the decade. Major news organizations once again assigned dedicated reporters to follow every stage of what was expected to become one of the year's most closely watched criminal trials. When the trial officially began, one of the moments the public had anticipated most was Gary Condit being called to testify. For the first time, after nearly a decade of avoiding the media, he was required to answer questions publicly under oath in court. Condit's testimony later became a source of controversy. Guandique's defense lawyer, Eugene Ohm, accused Condit of giving misleading information to the jury during his testimony, not about whether he had been involved in what happened, but about the nature of his relationship with Levy. Armando Morales, the prosecution's key witness, also testified in person, recounting in detail what he claimed Guandique had confessed to him while they were in prison. His testimony became the central pillar of the prosecution's entire case. As for Guandique, he chose not to testify before the jury. He personally informed the presiding judge of his decision, exercising his constitutional right to remain silent and not incriminate himself through direct testimony. That decision meant prosecutors had no opportunity to question Guandique directly in court, forcing the entire case to rely on circumstantial evidence and testimony from other witnesses, particularly Morales. During cross-examination, the defense focused on Morales' possible motives, questioning whether his testimony had been driven by a desire to receive a reduced sentence for his own offenses. Despite sustained and intense questioning, Morales remained firm and maintained his original account. This detail would become central to the legal crisis years later that ultimately led to the conviction being overturned, when doubts about Morales' true motives were finally shown to have a factual basis. For the Levy family, listening to the conflicting testimony, one side expressing certainty about Guandique's guilt, the other denying any involvement, was an emotionally agonizing experience. After waiting for nearly a decade, it was the first time they had heard key witnesses speak directly before a court. At the conclusion of the evidence, the judge formally announced that the defense had also decided not to call any additional witnesses, marking the point at which both sides had completed the presentation of their cases before the jury. According to many reporters present, the atmosphere inside the courtroom became particularly tense during the final days before the case was handed to the jury for deliberation. In her closing argument, the prosecutor brought together the entire chain of reasoning developed throughout the trial, From the pattern of attacks and Morales' testimony to the absence of any alternative explanation from the defense. Holding up a photograph of Levy smiling, she told the jury that this was the moment for justice to be delivered for the young woman, after her family had waited for nearly a decade. In response, the defense continued to emphasize the gaps in the scientific evidence: no DNA, no physical evidence, and no eyewitness who had seen what happened. They argued that the jury could not convict someone based solely on the testimony of a witness who may have had a personal motive to lie. Before the jury retired to deliberate, the presiding judge provided detailed legal instructions. The judge clearly explained the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt, as well as how jurors should assess the credibility of a witness with a criminal record and a possible personal motive for giving testimony. The jury then began its deliberations, considering the full body of evidence presented during weeks of testimony, including both the circumstantial evidence and the direct testimony of key witnesses. In November 2010, after several days of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Guandique was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, with each count based on a different legal theory concerning how the crime had occurred. The verdict brought an end to 9 years of waiting for the Levy family, and was widely regarded as a satisfying conclusion to one of the most closely followed cases in the history of Washington, D.C.'s criminal justice system. Yet, as time would later reveal, that satisfying conclusion was not the true end of the story. The testimony once considered the strongest pillar of the prosecution's case, Morales' testimony would become the reason the entire verdict was placed under serious scrutiny only a few years later. For the Levy family, hearing the verdict was one of the most emotionally intense moments they had ever experienced. After 9 years of living with uncertainty, justice finally appeared to have been delivered, even though no conviction could ever truly bring their daughter back. Outside the courtroom, crowds of reporters waited to capture the first reactions from both sides: the Levy family and Guandique's legal team, who immediately announced that they would continue pursuing every possible avenue of appeal. A few months after the verdict, the judge sentenced Guandique to 60 years in prison. The severe sentence reflected the seriousness with which the court viewed the case, even though the proceedings themselves acknowledged the absence of direct physical evidence throughout the investigation. Over the following years, Guandique's legal team continued to pursue every available avenue of appeal. In 2015, those efforts finally produced a breakthrough. His lawyers discovered that Morales had previously had contact with prosecutors' information that had not been fully disclosed to the defense during the original trial. The judge granted Guandique a new trial, ruling that the failure to disclose this information had violated his right to a fair trial. In July 2016, shortly before the planned retrial was due to begin, the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia made a shocking decision. All charges against Guandique were formally dismissed. In its official statement, the prosecution acknowledged that it could no longer prove the case beyond reasonable doubt. Susan Levy told the media that she was in a state of complete shock following the decision. After 15 years of waiting, the answer her family had once believed was certain disappeared in a single afternoon. The Metropolitan Police Department stated that it would continue pursuing any new leads that emerged. Guandique, who had spent years in prison following the conviction, was transferred to immigration authorities for deportation proceedings. As for Condit, his lawyer stressed that the dismissal of the charges against Guandique did not change the fact that Condit had been fully cleared many years earlier. His legal representative maintained that Condit had never been and would never be a target of the investigation. The case came to an extraordinary and unresolved conclusion. A conviction had been secured, upheld for years, and then completely overturned, leaving behind one central question that, to this day, no one has been able to answer with certainty. 25 years have passed since the morning Chandra Levy left her apartment near DuPont Circle. To this day, no one has been convicted and had that conviction upheld for responsibility for what happened to her. After being deported to El Salvador, Guandique largely disappeared from the attention of the American media. Very little public information is available about his current life, or whether he has ever revealed anything further about what truly happened in Rock Creek Park in 2001. The Chandra Levy case has left behind a profound legal lesson, one that has been examined in many American law schools. The enormous risks involved in building a serious criminal case, primarily on the testimony of a fellow inmate, a category of witness that may carry personal motives, can be difficult to verify, and, in this case, ultimately collapsed under close scrutiny. For the Levy family, the search for answers has never truly ended. Around the recent 25th anniversary of the case, her parents shared their own personal theories with the media about what may have happened, including controversial speculation involving intelligence agencies and unexplained phenomena. It must be made clear that these are entirely the family's personal views, shaped by the pain and frustration accumulated over 25 years without an official answer. They are not conclusions that have been confirmed or supported by any official investigative agency. For the former detectives who worked on the case from its earliest days, the sense of regret remains just as strong. Several of them, speaking in interviews marking the anniversary of the case, acknowledged that systemic mistakes during the initial investigation, particularly the excessive focus on conduct during the first several months, may have given the person truly responsible enough time to destroy evidence, or simply disappear beyond the reach of justice. Although the Metropolitan Police Department no longer devotes the same level of dedicated resources to the case as it did in the early years, it continues to classify the investigation as open and remains prepared to examine any new leads that may emerge. Yet after so many years, the likelihood of a major breakthrough has become increasingly fragile. Ultimately, the story of Chandra Levy is not simply a criminal case. It is a story about how a democracy confronts power, sex, and accountability, how the public can be willing to judge a politician based on moral suspicion, even when evidence of criminal involvement is entirely absent. 25 years later, the name Chandra Levy continues to appear among America's most haunting criminal mysteries, not because investigators failed to make an effort, but because each time justice appeared to be within reach, the truth slipped away once again, leaving behind a family still waiting and a question that may never receive a complete answer.